Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophets Speak. Today we are studying the final chapter of the book of Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah. And in this book, although it was relatively short, we had so many interesting events. We learned about the reforms that Nehemiah had made. We learned how he managed to get the city rebuilt on a physical level, get the people rebuilt on a spiritual level, the temple rebuilt, the temple organized, the Kohanim, the priests organized, the Levium, the Levites organized. He managed to repopulate the city. I mean, the achievements of Nehemiah as a leader is monumental. And of course, the what's sometimes called the Second Commonwealth, or the Second Temple period, lasted for hundreds of years on the foundation that Nehemiah had laid. The religious revival, the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the men of the Great Assembly, and the birth of Rabbinic Judaism. There's just so much that he did, and he had to do it with so much political opposition, and so on. The last thing we read about was the ceremony, the celebration that occurred, the parades that occurred around the city of Jerusalem to rededicate the newly rebuilt and repopulated city. Now we're about to learn in chapter 13 that something happened before that rededication, and if you recall, Nehemiah emphasized that the storehouses were used to be places as repositories, places to keep and store and protect the temple wealth and gifts, the produce that was brought for the first fruits, for the tithes, for the truma, for the donations, etc. We'll see in a minute what had happened that precipitated that emphasis in between. We're about to learn that. But Bayomahu, we're starting verse 1 in chapter 13, on that day, the day of the parades and the celebration, it wasn't just celebration and singing and trumpet playing and the cymbals and everything, but it was, and the processions, it was also the study and teaching of Torah, because Nikra b'Sefer Moshe b'Oznei ha'am. This is reminds us of, again, of the what we do in synagogue, what the Jewish religion to this day, the standard practice by every major holiday and Shabbat, when there is prayers in the synagogue, it is always accompanied by a public reading of the Torah, and so was this day. So Nikra b'Sefer Moshe b'Oznei ha'am, and when they read it, v'nimtza kasav, but one of the things they read was found that it was written there, Asher lo yavo Amoni u'Moavi b'kahal ha'Elohim ad olam, that no descendant of the nation of Ammon or the nation of Moab should join the congregation of God forever. And the reason is Kilo Kidmu et Bnei Yisrael b'lechem u'b'mayim, because they did not offer the people of Israel as they wandered they wandered in the desert. They didn't do what most people should do, is welcome people, passers-by, with bread and water, etc. And they didn't do that, but rather what they did was Vayiskar alav es Bilam. They hired Bilam Likalalo, to curse the people of Israel. Vayahafoch Eloheinu aklala levracha, and it was God who switched Bilam's curse and turned it into a blessing instead of a curse. Vayehi kisham ames haTorah, when they heard the Torah, vayavdilu kol erev miYisrael, they separated all of the mixture of people from the people of Israel. So what exactly happened here? There were no Ammonim or Moavim, right? At the time, the nation of Ammon and Moab had passed from the scene historically. There may have been some descendants, some remnants, but the nations of Ammon and Moab were long gone. After the Assyrian conquest, which preceded the ascent of the Persian Empire already, by this time it had been, a good probably 150 to 200 years since those nations were destroyed and gone and generations lost. So it wasn't so much to say that an Ammonite or a Moabite should be mixed, but the purpose here is the way I understand it, is that people saw this prohibition against the Ammonites and Moabites marrying into the Jewish people. And there's an emphasis here on the reason. The reason is because of their evil practices, because they were bad people, because of their evil influence. Which is why it says, Vayavdilu kol Erev mi Yisrael, all of those that were a mixture. That Erev has a negative connotation. The people that were refusing to accept upon themselves the Torah, the people that were a bad influence, those were the ones who were asked to leave. The people realized that by associating with those who are not willing to accept upon themselves the morality that the Torah and God was teaching, those people needed to go. And before this, Eliashiv HaKohen, before this entire day had happened, the chronology is a little confusing. However, the way it seems to be is that he's saying that before this entire day, before this whole procession that we just described in the last chapter, and before the reading of the Torah and the separation, the people separating the Erev mi Yisrael, right? The following had occurred. Eliashiv HaKohen, the Eliashiv, who was the high priest, Nosun b'lishkas Beitz Eloheinu, he had placed in the room of the house of our God, Karov Litovia, he was I'm sorry, Eliashiv HaKohen, who had been appointed over the rooms of the house of our God. I had left him as an appointee, right, to be in charge of those storerooms, which are obviously very important. The entire wealth and everything necessary to keep the temple running were in there. He happened to be a relative of Tovia. Tovia is one of the bad guys that was bothering Nehemiah before and was trying to stymie his efforts to rebuild the city. Vayaslo lishka gedola, and he made for him a big room. V'sham hayu lifanim, and that is where they originally nosnim would place at hamincha halavona v'akelim, the meal offerings, and the levona, which was the frankincense, which was necessary for the ketoret and other things, the akelim, umaser hadogan natir shvayitzer, and all the utensils needed for the temple, and the tithes of the grain, the wine, the oil, mitzvah halavim, that which was commanded to be given to the Levites, v'hameshorim, and the singers, v'ashoharim, and the gatekeepers, utrumas hakohanim, and the teruma, the donations that were given to the priests. So all this was done. He made him a room. He made Tovia, he gave him control of these rooms and made him a room. It seems like he gave him a room to stay, that he actually lived there on the temple precincts, and thereby had access to all of this wealth. And when all this had occurred, Lo hayisi b'Yerushalayim, I was not in Jerusalem. If you recall, way back in the beginning of the book, Nehemiah, when the king Artaxerxes, Artaxerxes, had given him permission to go on this mission to rebuild Jerusalem, he told him specifically, but you need to tell me when you're going to come back. Presumably, the king is very concerned if he were to send Nehemiah and allow him to just stay there, the possibility of him setting up shop and eventually challenging the king and trying to declare independence is higher. But by making sure he comes back, he makes sure that he stays loyal and stays loyal to the kingdom of Persia. So, because in the 32nd year of the reign of Artaxerxes, the king of Babylon, because remember, the Persian kings also called themselves the kings of Babylon because they had conquered Babylon. Basi el-Melech, I had returned to the king in Susa and Shushan, uleketzi amim nishalti min ha-Melech. And it was after a specific amount of time, although Nehemiah doesn't tell us how long he stayed there, I asked permission to return. And while I was gone, everything started to fall apart. They gave control of the room to Tovia. They put him in the Va'avol Yerushalayim, and I came back to Jerusalem. Va'avina, it sounds like he just showed up. It sounds like he came back to Jerusalem without having told the people he was coming, but it's not clear. And I saw this bad thing that Eliashiv, who I had left in charge, that he had done for Tovia, his relative, Lasas Lodnishka, to give him a place to rest, a room, in the temple precincts. It bothered me a lot. I went into the house of Tovia, and I threw out all of his stuff, all of his things outside of the room. I threw him out of the room and got rid of him from the temple. And I said, they had to go and purify those rooms because he had defiled them. And I replaced in there and put back in the vessels of the temple, at Mincha, Alavona, and the meal offerings and the frankincense. I started loading it back into the room where it should have been in the first place. And then I saw people stopped bringing presents to the Levites. A lot of people suggest that maybe the reason was they saw how corrupt it was. It became a family affair. Eliashiv and Tovia, they hanging out in the Beis Hamikdash, and they didn't deserve it. He wasn't a Kohen, he wasn't a priest, he wasn't a Levite, he wasn't a nobody, he was just a relative. And here he is hanging out, taking what he wanted. So they stopped bringing the gifts. So the whole thing, of course, as we always know, corruption, nepotism, causes everything to fall apart. People ran back to their fields, halavim. The Levites went back. They stopped doing their work in the temple. V'hameshorim and the singers, Osei HaMalacha, and all the people that did the work of the temple stopped staying there. And of course they did, because they weren't getting the tithes. They didn't have any way to support themselves other than going back. V'ariva et hasikonim, and I argued, I reprimanded the Siganim, the people in charge, Omer, and I said, why have we forsaken the house of God? I gathered them, and I reinstalled the Levites back in their place. And then once I did this, then the people of Judah started bringing back again the tithe of the grain, the wine, and the oils back to the temple treasury. And then I took the charge away from Eliashiv, who was clearly not trustworthy. I gave control to Shelemia HaKohen, to a different priest named Shelemia, Tzadok HaSofer, and Tzadok, who was a Sofer. Sofer is a word we used to refer to Ezra, means a Torah scholar, trustworthy Torah scholar. Ufidayah min halavim, and from the Levites I put a man named Pidayah in charge of Al Yadam, and in charge of them Chanan ben Zakur ben Matanya, I placed Chanan, the son of Zakur, son of Matanya. Why these people? Ki nemanim nechshavu, because I knew they were trustworthy. Va'aleim lachlok la'acheim, and they were responsible to give out the gifts and divide it up amongst their brothers, the other Levites. Zochra li Elohai alzos. Nehemiah now turns to God. Remember me, my God, regarding this issue. It seems that Nehemiah realized that this wasn't very popular. A lot of people were angry and upset. So he looks to God and says, God, at least you know that I did this right. Val temach chasodai. Do not erase the kindness, the greatness, asher asisi b'veis Elohai v'mishmarav, that I did in the house of God, and with those that are supposed to be guarding it and keeping it holy. Bayamim mahema, and in those days. So Nehemiah realizes when he does popular things, and also it seems the way he wrote it, you can feel his anger and his disappointment, which can also be interpreted as a bit of a character flaw. Nehemiah seems to be losing his control. But then he quickly, after getting really angry and throwing his stuff out of the house, throwing him out of the temple, getting, it's like when a company gets taken over by a new CEO and he cleans house, and then he realizes he got a lot of people upset. But he did what he thought he had to do to make things better, and he turns to God and says, God, at least you understand why I did what I did. In those same days, Ra'isi v'Yehuda, I saw in Yehuda, remember the people had promised how they were going to keep Shabbat and everything. Dorchim gitot b'Shabbat, they were treading in their wine presses on Shabbat. Umivim ha'aremot v'omsim al achamorim, and they were bringing their bundles and loading up their donkeys on Shabbat. V'af yayin anovim u'te'enim, and they were bringing in wine and grapes and figs. V'chol masa, and all kinds of loads. Umivim Yerushalayim b'yom HaShabbat, and they were bringing it into Jerusalem on the day of Shabbat. Va'id b'yom michram tzoyed. And remember, these were the things they promised not to do. In their constitution, all the people came forward and said what they were going to do to keep Shabbat special and holy. Some of these are rabbinic prohibitions that were laid down. Nehemiah, before he went to the king, and everyone agreed with all pomp and circumstance. Some of these are Torah prohibitions, but here they were not keeping Shabbat properly as they had agreed. So I started. I immediately started to admonish or to criticize them for selling supplies on Shabbat. V'hatzorim yashuva, and the people from Tyre. These are Tyrian merchants. Tyre was famous as a city of merchants. It was a central location where goods and money was exchanged in those days. So there were Tyrian merchants that were meviim dog v'chomecha. They were bringing fish from the Mediterranean, all kinds of things to sell. Mochrim b'Shabbat l'bnei Yehuda. They were selling all these things on Shabbat to the people that resided in Judea and in Yerushalayim and in Jerusalem. V'ariva et chorei Yehuda. So again, ariva is a very angry sounding word. I'm trying to think of the right English word here, ariva, and I rebuked the Chorei Yehuda, the noblemen of Judah, va'omr lehem, and I said to them, Ma davar hara hazeh asher atem osim. What is this bad thing that you guys are doing? U'machalim yom Shabbat. You are profaning the day of Shabbat, the day of the Sabbath. This is what your forefathers did. We're trying to start something new here, and you guys are making the same mistakes that they did back then. And we all know what happened at the end of the first temple period and what kind of a disaster that became. That's why God brought upon us all of this bad that we see. And on this city. And now you're adding anger of God against the people of Israel because you are profaning the Shabbat. So when the gates of Jerusalem started to darken as the Shabbat day was arriving, in other words, Friday afternoon as the sun was setting, Va'omra, I said, Vayiskoru hadlasos, close the doors, lock the gates. Va'omra, and I said, Asher lo yiftachum arachar Shabbat. These gates should not be opened until after the Sabbath is over, so that these merchants and all these products can't come in and out on that day. And I took some of my trustworthy guys that were with me, I set them up as guards over the gates, that lo yavo maso b'yom Shabbat, to ensure that no one would somehow sneak in with a load on the day of Shabbat. Vayalinu haroch lememochre kol mimkar, and michutz liYerushalayim pamushtayim. And if sometimes people even got stuck outside the gates, and I didn't care, they had to stay outside the gates, even though that wasn't really safe and certainly not pleasant for them. But he made a rule: gates are closed. If you're not in, if you're in Shabbat, you're in. If you're out, don't come. And I criticized them. And I told them, why are you? And these people that were lying outside had been attempting to get in to Jerusalem on Shabbat with their loads. So I say, why are you lying opposite the wall? In other words, thinking that maybe if you lie out there with your loads, maybe you'll catch a little business here and there. Some people might wander out and you'll sell to the guys on the side. If you do this again, I am going to punish you. It's Yadesh Lachbam would sound like lashes, whipping. We'll see. And after I warned them, they stopped coming on Shabbat. And I said to the Levites, that they should purify themselves and come to guard the gates, to sanctify the day of Shabbat. Again, Nehemiah now turns to God, knowing that this was an extremely unpopular move. The first time before he went back to Ardis, when he first came, he was gaining favor as he put things together and everyone got together to work and so on and so forth. He had enemies, but he managed to unify the people against the enemies and rebuild Jerusalem. Now he comes and he's making enemies everywhere. So he turns to God and says, this too, God, remember me for good. V'chusa alai, have mercy on me, kirov chasdecha, because you are so merciful. You're so kind, God. Gam bayom lahem, another problem. Reisias haYehudim oshivu nashim ashdodiot amoniot moaviot. The Jewish people had been marrying women Ashdodiot. These are descendants probably of the Phoenicians or Philistines, and Ammonite descendants and Moabite descendants. They were marrying into all these families the people that lived within the land, they had brought back those women that they had claimed, the ones that did not want to convert. Remember, Nehemiah had emphasized several times the people that converted into Judaism and were willing to accept the Torah of God stayed and were welcomed, but those that did not remained a bad influence, and here they brought them all back. So everything that he had thought he accomplished before didn't work, and it came to the point of Nehem Chatzi Medaber Ashdodit, and half, a whole bunch of the children of these families, they were imbibing the culture of their mothers, which makes sense because that's what usually happens, and speaking the language, the Ashdodite language. They couldn't even speak Hebrew. Literally, they couldn't speak Judean. They couldn't speak Jewish. And they spoke the language of various other peoples that their mothers came from. Again, I rebuked them. This is like an angry word. And I cursed them. Some of these men, I gave them lashes in the streets, and I tore out their hair, and I made them swear by God that they should no longer give their daughters to their sons, and they should not take their daughters for themselves or take their daughters for their sons. So it seems clear that Nehemiah did not ask them to divorce these women. He just made them promise from here on in not to do it anymore, which is very interesting. And the emphasis here on speaking Hebrew is must go recognized and mentioned that Nehemiah is saying this. It's because of these things. And here's where Nehemiah makes it clear why these women, it's generally the men marrying the foreign women, but it also went the other way around, as we saw, sons to daughters, daughters to sons, etc. But Nehemiah is saying why, when they don't accept upon themselves the Jewish religion, when they don't become one of us, when they don't join like the Ruth did, who joined the Jewish religion, but when they maintain their own thing. And we see this is what happened when King Solomon, the king of Israel, sinned. In all the nations there was no king as great as he was. He was beloved by his God. And God made him king over all the Jews. Even he was such a great man. The foreign wives that he brought into his home that maintained their idolatrous practices, it caused him to sin and led him astray. So how can we hear and listen and hear that you guys are doing such a terrible thing and rebelling against our God, to bring into your homes women that are nachrios, that are idol worshippers, and from the children of Yoyada, the son of Eliashiv, who was the Kohen Gadol, Chasan l'Sanbalat Choroni. He had married, he was the son-in-law of Sanballat, the big enemy from early on in this book, if you recall. Sanballat was the big enemy of Avricheu me'alai. I chased him away from me, even though he had such illustrious lineage. The fact that he had married into that family, that was too much. And again, Nehemiah realizes he just made a lot of enemies in a lot of high places and and some low places, but all over, he just made a lot of enemies. So again, he turns to God and says, Zachro lohem Elohai, remember their evil ways, my God. Al Galei Hakuna, those that ruined the priesthood, Uvrit Kahuna, and the covenant of the priesthood by marrying into these idolatrous families, Vahalavim, and the Levites as well. V'tiartim mikol nechar, I purified them of all the foreign people, the ones who were not in the Jewish religion. Va'amida mishmaros, and I established groups, shifts, and lakoanim v'alavim mishmalachto. And remember, last chapter occurred after this chapter. So I set up the Mishmarot, and then we made that ceremony that we read in the last chapter. Kurban ha'etzim ba'itim mizumanos v'labikurim. I made sure that there would be shifts in order to make sure that the wood was properly brought in its proper times, and for the first fruits to be divided up properly. Zachar li Elohai l'tova, remember me, my God, for good, Nehemiah says. Nehemiah realizes that by doing all of these actions, by making such noise, in such an angry way, Nehemiah didn't behave this way the first time around, but the second time around, frustration led him to act in this very angry way. And many the rabbis of the Talmud were critical of Nehemiah and the way he acted on some level, even though we understand his frustration and his reforms were important. He had to deal with reality, and reality is that people do what people do. And as we know, Nehemiah's reforms were only moderately successful, might have bought everyone some time, but as time went on, corruption set in, problems set in, and the people were far from perfect. But Nehemiah did also start the mechanism of Rabbinic Judaism, which also created the religion which lasted until this day. So to that effect, he was extremely successful. He might not have realized at the time how successful he would be, but he was. Thank you so much for studying Nehemiah chapter 13. This concludes a large portion of the prophets and the writings, the narrative portions, the historical portions, which we started when I started studying in the beginning of this podcast, the book of Isaiah. We did not. I started Isaiah. I explained that when I did it because it was my favorite book of the Bible, of the Torah, and I talked to you about that in the beginning of this podcast. I left out I skipped over the beginning books of the Nevi'im, of the prophets, the early prophets, Nevi'im Rishonim. We didn't do yet the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. So we're going to go back. Next, I'm going to go back and start from the book of Joshua, which will begin soon, and go through Joshua, Judges, Kings, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and then do Chronicles. And then after that, we'll do the various books of wisdom from the writings that are not really narrative, such as the Song of Songs, Shir Hashirim, Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, and those other, and Eov, Job. We'll do those books after that. So next, I'm looking forward to studying Joshua together with you, and thank you so much for joining me.